Genesis 25. I already prepared the board, so it's ready to go. Otherwise, I'm going to just be standing here writing the whole time. Genesis 25. Let's just jump right into this chapter. It has a few main sections to it. So in verse 1. Abraham took another wife, whose name was Keturah. She bore him Zimran, Jokshan, Medan, Midian, Ishbak, and Shua. Jokshan fathered Sheba and Dedan. The sons of Dedan were Asherim, Letushim, and Lumim. The sons of Midian were Ephah, Epher, Hanak, Abida, and Eldaah. All these were the children of Keturah. Abraham gave all he had to Isaac, but to the sons of his concubines Abraham gave gifts. And while he was still living, he sent them away from his son Isaac, eastward to the east country. These are the days of the years of Abraham's life, 175 years. Abraham breathed his last and died in a good old age, an old man and full of years, and was gathered to his people. Isaac and Ishmael, his sons, buried him in the cave of Machpelah, in the field of Ephron, the son of Zohar the Hittite, east of Mamre, the field that Abraham purchased from the Hittites. There Abraham was buried with Sarah his wife. After the death of Abraham, God blessed Isaac his son, and Isaac settled at Beer-lahai-roi. These are the generations of Ishmael, Abraham's son, whom Hagar the Egyptian, Sarah's servant, bore to Abraham. These are the names of the sons of Ishmael, named in the order of their birth. Nebaioth, the firstborn of Ishmael, and Kedar, Adbeel, Misbam, Mishma, Duma, Massa, Hadad, Tema, Jetur, Naphish, and Kedemah. These are the sons of Ishmael, and these are their names, by their villages and by their encampments, 12 princes according to their tribes. These are the years of the life of Ishmael, 137 years. He breathed his last and died, and was gathered to his people. They settled from Havilah to Shur, which is opposite Egypt, in the direction of Assyria. He settled over against all his kinsmen. These are the generations of Isaac, Abraham's son. Abraham fathered Isaac, and Isaac was 40 years old when he took Rebekah, the daughter of Bethuel the Aramean of Padan Aram, the sister of Laban the Aramean, to be his wife. And Isaac prayed to the Lord for his wife because she was barren, and the Lord granted his prayer, and Rebekah his wife conceived. The children struggled together within her, and she said, "If it is thus, why is this happening to me?" So she went to inquire of the Lord. And the Lord said to her, 2 nations are in your womb, and 2 peoples are within you shall be divided. The one shall be stronger than the other, the older shall serve the younger. When her days to give birth were completed, behold, there were twins in her womb. The first came out red, all his body like a hairy cloak. So they called his name Esau. Afterward his brother came out with his hand holding Esau's heel, so his name was called Jacob. Isaac was 60 years old when she bore them. When the boys grew up, Esau was a skilled hunter, a man of the field, while Jacob was a quiet man, dwelling in tents. Isaac loved Esau because he ate of his game, but Rebekah loved Jacob. Once, when Jacob was cooking stew, Esau came in from the field, and he was exhausted. And Esau said to Jacob, "Let me eat some of the red stew, for I am exhausted." Therefore his name was called Edom. Jacob said, "Sell me your birthright now." Esau said, "I am about to die. Of what use is the birthright to me?" Jacob said, "Swear to me now." So he swore to him and sold his birthright to Jacob. Then Jacob gave Esau bread and lentil stew, and he ate and drank and rose and went his way. Thus Esau despised his birthright. All right, so let's start digging into this chapter. Like I said, some interesting and main things happening in here. Abraham was married again to a woman named Keturah. Keturah had 6 sons. Who wants to name all 6 sons? Obadiah, I'm just playing. Of those 6 sons, we are only told the descendants of 2. And those two are Jokshan and Midian. Out of those two men come 7 more sons and 2 grandsons. And realize that many of these people birthed entire groups of other people, entire nations were born here. The people of Sheba and Dedan lived close to each other and became known for trading spices. In fact, they're mentioned again in Ezekiel 38. I'm just going to read it for you. Ezekiel 38, verse 13 says, Sheba and Dedan and the merchants of Tarshish and all its leaders will say to you, have you come to seize spoil? Have you assembled your hosts to carry off plunder, to carry away silver and gold, to take away livestock and goods, to seize great spoil? See, these nations in this passage are part of this prophecy in Ezekiel. It began all the way back here in Genesis 25. And Midian comes back in a few different ways. When Moses fled to Egypt after killing an Egyptian in Exodus 2, where did he flee to? Midian. He fled to the land of Midian. This is where the Midianites had settled hundreds of years after this point in Genesis. Moses stayed there and he tended sheep until God called him to lead the Israelites out of Egypt. And what was Moses' wife's name? Zipporah. Zipporah was a Midianite. And Moses received great wisdom from his father-in-law Jethro, who was a Midianite priest. So Midian has a huge legacy for even just the nation of Israel, how it was constructed. This is where Moses found safety. This is where Moses found his wife. When Moses was dealing with problems of authority and how to judge everyone, he received wisdom from his father-in-law Jethro, who was from Midian. So Midian has a huge legacy for Israel. However, it's not all candy and roses. The Midianites were often against the Israelites too. In fact, just take a second, keep your finger in Genesis 25, and go to Judges. Judges chapter 6. Judges chapter 6, we're just going to look at the first 3 verses. It says this: The people of Israel did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, and the Lord gave them into the hand of Midian 7 years. And the hand of Midian overpowered Israel, and because of Midian the people of Israel made for themselves the dens that are in the mountains and the caves and the strongholds. For whenever the Israelites planted crops, the Midianites and the Amalekites and the people of the east would come up against them. So Midian was used by God to discipline Israel. And if we continue to read through Judges 7, we would see that Gideon and his 300 men conquered the Midianites. But let's just take a moment to understand, this is one of the main lessons for today. Let's take a moment to understand the sovereignty of God. Generations before Moses was born and would need a safe place to flee to, God was already birthing a nation through Abraham for him to flee to. Hundreds of years before Moses got married, God was already raising up ancestors that would eventually lead to Moses' wife, Zipporah. Before Israel ever did evil in the sight of the Lord, that he was going to punish them for specifically, God was preparing the nation that would discipline them. So this ties into the point that we made last week, or 2 weeks ago, I should say. Last week was Super Bowl, huh? 2 weeks ago, God was already working to answer the prayer that the servant was already going to pray to him. We should understand that God's already working to answer our prayers even before we pray them. Before we even know the situation, God is already at work to work in it. Just like what was happening here. God was already raising up a nation that would affect things in the future. So trust in him. He's already proven his faithfulness to us. We just don't know it yet. All right, let's come back to Genesis. Genesis 25. The genealogy that we see here in Genesis 25 actually pops up again in 1 Chronicles. So I'm going to read 1 Chronicles 1. You just follow along in Genesis And I want you to notice some similarities and some differences. All right, so the genealogy that we're looking at is the sons of Keturah. It says this: the sons of Keturah, Abraham's concubine. She bore Zimran, Jokshan, Medan, Midian, Ishbak, and Shua. The sons of Jokshan, Sheba, and Dedan. The sons of Midian, Ephah, Epher, Hanak, Abida, and Eldaah. All these were the descendants of Keturah. Follow one more time, I'm going to read it again. The sons of Keturah, Abraham's concubine. She bore Zimran, Jokshan, Medan, Midian, Ishbak, and Shua. The sons of Jokshan, Sheba, and Dedan. The sons of Midian, Ephah, Epher, Hanak, Abida, and Eldaah. All these were the descendants of Keturah. Now I'm sure you noticed with me that there's a lot of similarities, but there are two notable differences. And what are they? Huh? Right. No son, they weren't mentioned. No son, the sons of Jokshan weren't mentioned. And one other one. What was Keturah called? Yeah, see, in 1 Chronicles she's called a concubine. In Genesis she's called a wife. So in biblical times, a concubine was a woman who lived with a man as if she were his wife, but had a lower status than his wife. So Keturah is called a wife in Genesis 25. This is because Sarah had died, Abraham had remarried. But in 1 Chronicles, when Abraham's descendants are listed, Keturah and thus her children take a lesser status than Isaac and Ishmael. So they're highlighting the elevated status of Isaac and Ishmael. Any questions on that? All right, let's go to verses 5 and 6. Abraham is showing wisdom here. What wisdom is he showing? Verses 5 and 6. Yeah, well, he's kind of disposing of his property while he's still alive. Abraham has a ton of wealth and cattle and servants and just tons of things. So everything goes to Isaac, but he does give presents to his other sons as well, and then sends them on their way. Essentially, he's making sure that everyone knows that Isaac is the sole heir, and makes any person who would oppose Isaac to leave by his authority, by Abraham's authority. He's kind of taking care of business so that when he does die, Isaac won't have to worry about that. And Abraham's taking steps to ensure that the covenant that God promised through Isaac would, that no one would doubt that it's Isaac specifically that it's through. And look at the start of verse 6. Where do these other sons come from? Yeah, Abraham's concubines, plural. All but Isaac are called sons of concubines. And so again, even Abraham might have considered Keturah as a lesser status of a wife or a concubine as well. But then, after having put all of his affairs in order, Abraham passes away. Look at verses 7 to 11. It says, "These are the days of the years of Abraham's life, 175 years. Abraham breathed his last and died in a good old age, an old man and full of years, and was gathered to his people," and so on. See, Abraham was 175 years. His sons, Isaac and Ishmael, buried him. And where was he buried? In that cave he bought. Yep. And the land that would be the promised land that God would give to his descendants. And so he was buried next to his wife Sarah. And then pay attention to, the attention is about to center on a new person in the narrative. Verse 11 says, after the death of Abraham, God blessed who? Isaac, his son. And Isaac settled in Beer Lahai Roi. Do you remember where that is? It was the place of the angel's appearance to Hagar. It means the living one sees me. So Isaac came from this place in the last chapter before meeting his wife, and he returns there now and settles down for a little bit. Now, just a little interesting fact here. I'm going to go back to Genesis 11 for a moment, if you want to go back there with me. Genesis 11, I'm just going to read verses 10 to 11. This is right after the flood. And if you look at just verse 10 for a second, it says, these are the generations of Shem. And if you dart your eyes down to verse 26, this generation ends with Terah, who fathered Abram, Nahor, and Haran. Okay? So verses 10 to 11, these are the generations of Shem. When Shem was 100 years old, he fathered Arpachshad. I didn't practice that one before today. 2 years after the flood. And Shem lived, and after he fathered Arpachshad, 500 years, and had other sons and daughters. Okay? So, how long did Shem live after having Arpachshad? 500 years. 500 years. So I'm going to just take you through this here. This is the 500 years after he fathered Arpachshad. At year 290, if you follow that generation thing down in that passage, Terah was born. Okay? Or sorry, Terah had Abram 290 years later. So at this point, 290 years after Shem had Arpachshad, Terah had Abraham. That means that when Abraham had Isaac, Shem was still at the 390-year mark of that 500 years. So Shem was still alive when Isaac was born. And then, that means when Abraham died, Shem was still 465 years after having Arpachshad. So Shem was still alive when Abraham died. And then finally, he was alive for about another 50 years of Jacob's life. So Shem was still alive for quite a bit of history of what's going on here in Genesis. Sometimes it's hard for us to remember that because Shem just kind of drops out of the picture all the way back in Genesis 11. But he's still alive all the way to this point. And for my own curiosity, by the way, I figured out that Noah was alive for about 58 years or so. So Noah died about here of Abraham's life. Mm-hmm. There might have been a gap, but probably not. It could have been multiple wives, though, too, you know. Yeah. But yeah, so, yeah, Shem is still living for quite a bit of time. He's witnessing a lot of history in his lifetime. Come back to Genesis 25, verse 12. From there we receive a quick synopsis of Ishmael's life and his descendants. Just like Jacob will do at a later date, Ishmael has 12 sons, and they disperse throughout the Middle East area. And remember that we talked about earlier, much earlier, when we were going through Genesis, how the problems with peace in the Middle East started all the way back in Genesis. Muslims trace their lineage of Muhammad back to Kedar, the son of Ishmael, here in Genesis 25, specifically the end of verse 13. And Kedar, Adbeel, and Mibsam. I kept putting the S in beforehand. So yeah, they trace their lineage back to there. They say, we are descendants of Ishmael. So, when Abraham and Sarah tried to accomplish things in their own strength and tried to accomplish God's promise in their own strength, still has ramifications to today. And it's interesting, too, that the Islamic religion is all about accomplishing salvation in their own strength. If they keep all the rules, if they have complete obedience, they will be saved, they believe. So their practices of religion come straight out of their origin. Still, Ishmael lived 137 years, and he passed away too. Let's go to the birth of Esau and Jacob. This is the next generation to be traced, and it's from the coming from Isaac. And this one will take longer than 6 verses. This one will take the rest of Genesis. How old was Isaac when he married Rebekah? 40 years old. And so at the start of this narrative, Isaac was considerably younger than Abraham when he started out. Abraham was 75 years old when he was called to leave. Isaac was 40. But this also means that if we go back, that we're going back in time a little bit. See, Abraham, when he had Isaac, was 100 years old at that point. It's not until 75 years later that Abraham died. So if Isaac is only 40 years old when he was married to Rebekah, that puts him at about here. Nope, sorry, just a little bit before, about here. And then 20 years later, at 60, he has Jacob and Esau. And so Abraham is still alive for Esau and Jacob being born. They're just kind of putting an end to Abraham's life, saying this is kind of the end to his impact in what's going on in life. But now let's back up and look at Jacob and Esau, and we'll go on from there. So Shem was also alive then for Esau and Jacob's birth. Abraham was 160 years old at that time. Isaac was 60 years old. I don't know where Shem would have lived in relationship to all this. Right. Yeah, with how people dispersed throughout the earth after the flood, I mean, man, Shem could have gone anywhere, right? So, because, by the time, if Shem was here when he had Arphaxad, and Abraham, let's say, is about here when he goes to Egypt, right, and meets the Pharaoh, that means quite a bit of people, quite a bit of civilizations have risen up in a short amount of time. In a few hundred years, there's people just populating all of the earth. So that when Abraham gets to Egypt, they had no idea who he was. They couldn't trace really back his lineage to the original, Noahite family. So yeah, I mean, people are spreading out, people are multiplying. There is just population growth going on. Yeah, because they had 12 kids. Anyways, so Isaac is 40 here, meaning that these next events are still happening in Abraham's lifetime. But anyway, look at verse 21. What does Isaac do? Prays for his wife. Yeah, Hannah was. Yeah, all the key women were gracious saying had kids that were important, but that was a way to show God's faithfulness and His power. Hannah when was barren before Samuel the prophet was born. But yeah, Isaac prays for his wife, and this is the first time that a prayer of intercession is recorded in the Bible. So of everything that's happened up to this point, this is the first time that someone goes and prays to God for someone else. And this is the second time in a generation that the wife is barren. But again, I think this is to help us see just the grace and power of God that makes the covenant possible and over against human strength and action. But God grants this prayer and Rebekah conceives. And so let's see what happens next. Verse 22 and 23. The children struggled together within her, and she said, If it is thus, why is this happening to me? And so she went to inquire of the Lord, and God gives her kind of a prophecy of things to come. So Rebekah was pregnant with twins without being aware of it. And, it was tough to understand what twins were, even 100 years ago. This is the first time in recorded history that we understand that someone was having twins. So this is probably not quite the normal yet. And if it is, she still was like, what's going on inside of me? The children jostle with each other. Rebekah is alarmed. She wonders what's happening to her, and she goes to God in prayer. So now Isaac's example of intercessory prayer prompts her intercessory prayer for herself. And God answers and gives an indication of things to come. There are 4 takeaways from God's answer. So look at the first line of his answer. 2 nations are in your womb. What is the first takeaway in that first line? Very just like plain as the nose on your face. There'll be two nations that come out of her. Very, very simple, right? God says two nations are in your womb. Our takeaway is that two nations are going to come out of her. Okay? Look at the second line. What's the takeaway from the second line? Yeah, those two nations will be divided. Okay? Two nations are coming out. They're going to be divided. What's the third takeaway from the third line? One nation will be stronger than the other. And the last from the last line. The older will serve the younger. This is exactly what will happen in the future. Out of Esau came the Edomites, and out of Jacob came the Israelites. These two nations were divided against each other. They were constantly fighting with each other. And Edom took part, thousands of years down the road, took part in the conquering of the southern kingdom of Judah with the Babylonians. When Babylonians came and invaded Judah and was carrying people off, the Edomites were helping them do that. So this, the indication that one would be stronger than the other, actually refers to Esau and the Edomites. They would have a natural proclivity to being greater than Jacob and the Israelites. They were often stronger. They were often able to conquer. However, God decrees that Esau, the stronger one, will still serve Jacob, the younger one. God shows favor for the younger one over the older one. Does God ever show this again in the Bible? Does he ever show preference for the younger over the older? Ephraim and Manasseh, that's a great example. Huh? Joseph is another good example. Yep. David, another great example. He was the youngest in his family. Moses was the youngest in his family. Aaron and Miriam were older. Jesus taught it in his teachings. Jesus taught that the first shall be last and the last shall be first. Jesus taught and exemplified humility, so it wasn't a new teaching. People should have kind of understood this when he was doing this. God was already showing through his approval of the younger over the older what Jesus would teach both in his words and in his example later on. He showed us that we should care for the poor and downtrodden. So since the very beginning of time, God has been concerned with the weaker and given preference to the humble. So our God is unchanging, and we see it all the way back here in Genesis. And thousands of years later, God, through Paul, revealed the spiritual significance of this prophecy right here. Go to Romans chapter 9 for a moment. Romans chapter 9, verses 10 to 15. So God gives an indication of things to come. This is what will happen throughout the Israelites' history. And then Paul picks this up and shows us the spiritual significance of all of this. Romans chapter 9, starting in verse 10. And not only so, but also when Rebekah had conceived children by one man, our forefather Isaac, though they were not yet born and had done nothing, either good or bad, in order that God's purpose of election might continue, not because of works, but because of him who calls, she was told, the older will serve the younger. As it is written, Jacob I loved, but Esau I hated. What shall we say then? Is there injustice on God's part? By no means, for he says to Moses, I will have mercy on whom I have mercy, and I will have compassion on whom I have compassion. I'm going to stop there because we could really dig into the meat of this chapter and be here for another couple weeks. But here we see that there was a deeper purpose behind Jacob and Esau. Every natural advantage of a person doesn't mean anything to God when it comes to salvation. Whether they're rich, poor, smart, stupid, beautiful, ugly, everything gives way to God's grace and mercy. Now, this passage does give us some insight into the discussion of predestination and free will. We're not going to talk about that tonight, for sake of time. we could spend a few weeks and months on that topic alone, and someday we will, just not today, because we're looking at Genesis 25. For today, I just want you to see that when God acts in Genesis in this specific moment of time, it has eternal ramifications. Thousands of years later in the book of Romans, we see the spiritual significance of this event. And thousands of years after that, we're still living it out. So be encouraged. I like to say this over and over again. Genesis just isn't a book of antiquated stories that we teach in Sunday school. We need to pay close attention to what's going on in here because it still has bearing today. All right, come back to Genesis 25. Verses 24 to 26. The decree/prophecy that God gave is proven true. Esau comes out first. What was his description? I like his description. All red and hairy. Jesse and Brianna aren't here. I was going to talk about Chewbacca for a moment because I know they'd appreciate it. But he comes out red and hairy. The word Esau in Hebrew literally means hairy. Jacob comes out next and is holding Esau's heel. Jacob most literally means he clutches the heel. But it can also mean to follow, to be behind, to supplant, to overreach, and to be a usurper. So that's kind of Jacob's legacy and his name coming out. Isaac was 60 years old when the twins were born. This means that Abraham was 160 years old. And again, this also means that Shem was at the 450-year mark of his 500 years after his son. Shem, the son of Noah, was alive for another 50 years of Jacob's life. Now, in verse 20, Isaac is said to be 40. And in verse 21, it says that he prays to God, that God answers his prayer. And then in verse 26, it says that Isaac was 60 when the prayer was answered. So there's two possible explanations or interpretations for this. First, Isaac could have prayed when he was 40, and God didn't answer the prayer until 20 years later. This would have taught Isaac and Rebekah patience and to trust God to act in his way and in his timing. Or 20 years after Isaac and Rebekah were married, he prayed to God, and God answered that prayer almost right away. This would have taught Isaac and Rebekah to trust God, that God hears them and that he is all-powerful, and that they had seen that she was barren for 20 years, and only God, not their own strength, had the ability to change that. We have no indication which one of those two possibilities happened. In the Hebrew, it just puts it out that he was 40, there was a prayer, now he's 60, and there's birth. It doesn't give us a direct chronological timeline. So both are plausible. I'm inclined to think the second one, that they waited 20 years and prayed, and then God answered their prayer almost immediately, only because it kind of happens in that same verse. But either way, God proves his goodness in response to Isaac's prayer. And then in verses 27 to 34, Esau and Jacob grow up. Esau is a hunter. Isaac chose him as his favorite. This will be important in the future. Jacob was a quiet man, and Rebekah chose him as her favorite. That'll also be important in the future. But for now, Jacob is cooking some stew. Esau is hungry. And so Jacob said to him he'd give him some food if he what? Sold his birthright. If he'd sell his birthright to him. Is it just me, or does that escalate kind of quickly? No? Like Esau comes in, hey, I'm hungry. It's like, all right, sell me your birthright. I feel like that's a quick escalation. But, and let me just say, Esau, when he asks for food, his words are expressive of uncontrolled hunger. He doesn't just say, feed me. He says, let me swallow, or almost let me gulp. And he doesn't even ask for food. His words are he says, the red, that red. He doesn't say stew. He doesn't say, give me whatever you're cooking. He just looks, says, that red stuff right there, give me some. Okay? So he is kind of famished, just like we would say some of that red stuff there. And because of this, what was he called at the end of verse 30? Edom. Yep. Edom is the Hebrew word for red. In fact, say Edom with me. Ready? Edom. You just all spoke Hebrew. Good job. You can impress your friends later and be like, hey, pass me that Edom apple. You can be like, I just spoke Hebrew to you. You're welcome. But can you imagine the whole nation of Edom tracing their name back to this moment in time? Why are you called Edom? Well, because our founding ancestor was hungry and found some red stew. Anyway, he's desperately hungry, and Jacob goes right for the birthright. And the question is why? Why would Jacob, like I said, kind of escalate things kind of quickly? Why would he go for the birthright? Well, there was this prophecy / decree a few verses ago. Do you think that was never repeated to Jacob or Esau? Like God tells Rebekah, the older will serve the younger, and she never repeated that to anyone else ever? Probably not. I think she loved Jacob, right? Jacob was kind of her favorite. Do you think that she probably went to him and said, by the way, Esau's going to serve you? Okay, you're going to be kind of divided against each other, so expect that. But he's going to serve you even though he's going to be stronger. I think that's probably exactly what happened. Jacob most likely knew that he would have this authority or preeminence over Esau at some point, and here was an opportunity, just falling into his lap. Why not take care of that right here, right now? But also there may be things going on that we aren't aware of. One, Esau seems to have a flair for the dramatic. Would Esau have actually died from hunger at this moment in time? Probably not. It is highly doubtful that he would have actually died here. Hearing Jacob's condition, saying, hey, sell me your birthright, Esau could have been like, I'm going to go find food somewhere else. Asked anyone else to make him food. After all, he was the oldest. He would have had a lot of authority in his father's camp. So if he just took a second to think about it, he could have gotten food. But second, other than just a slight protest, Esau just lets go of his birthright pretty quickly. Even before he despises it at the end of verse 34, Esau is treating his birthright kind of flippantly here. He trades it for a bowl of soup. In fact, this is what Hebrews 12:16-17 references. This is what it says. See to it that no one who is sexually immoral or unholy like Esau, who sold his birthright for a single meal. For you know that afterward, when he desired to inherit the blessing, he was rejected, for he found no chance to repent, though he sought it with tears. In other words, don't trade the eternal for the temporary. And that's our other lesson for today. Don't trade the eternal for the temporary, because that's what Esau did, and he couldn't get it back. Whatever the immediate reason for all of this happening, we see the larger reason at play. Jacob was chosen to continue the covenant. Esau was not. And the first steps are being taken toward this reality here at the end of chapter 25. Repeat. Yeah, Gracia's wondering what mother would actually do this, like make a problem between her sons. But yeah, the problem is we see her loving Jacob, and then later purposefully deceive her husband to give the blessing to Jacob. And so we're not seeing people act perfectly, and we don't have to say that these people acted perfectly. But that God still worked through it. Even at the end of Joseph's life, and Joseph talks to all his brothers and say, you meant all this for evil, God meant it for good. Even when we don't act perfectly, which is every day, God can still use that for good. So yeah, Rebecca doesn't seem to be the shining example of motherhood right now. But, yeah. Right. Yeah. Esau might have been thinking, Gracia said, that, maybe Jacob will forget about this. And really, if someone came in and said, hey, give me your birthright for this cup of soup, there's no one around here that's, I'm not signing a contract, but still, yeah. Esau wasn't being serious about his birthright. He'd be very flippant with it. Any other questions or additional insights into this passage? All right. That's all for tonight. Thank you for coming. Have a good week. Stay warm out there, especially if it gets snowy like we're supposed to get.